Medieval England faced a collapse written not just in ink, but in bone and soil. This is the story of a society shattered by hunger, but the full truth lies buried. Historical chronicles speak of a terrible time, yet they offer only a fragment of the picture. To truly understand the scale of this catastrophe, we must look to the ground itself. Archaeology provides the physical evidence for a climate-driven disaster, revealing how an entire world can unravel from a change in the weather. By the end, you will see how the silent testimony of skeletons, seeds, and abandoned homes rewrites our understanding of this profound crisis. What do the remains of a single tooth or the layout of a forgotten field tell us about a kingdom brought to its knees? How does a society's fragility become permanently etched into the landscape? The answers are waiting, uncovered piece by piece from the earth. What does it mean for a civilization to be truly vulnerable? The years from 1315 to 1322 are known to historians as the Great Famine. This was not a single, isolated season of hardship, but a relentless 7-year siege against the very foundation of medieval life, which was agriculture. The crisis had a clear and devastating origin, one written not in political decisions but in the sky itself. It began with a profound shift in the weather patterns across northern Europe, a period so abnormally wet and cold it earned the name the Great Rain. Summer after summer, the skies remained a stubborn, leaden gray. Torrential downpours became the norm, drowning fields, preventing crops from ripening and washing away the precious topsoil. The grain that did manage to grow often rotted in the damp, muddy fields before it could ever be harvested. This was a catastrophe of climate, a failure of the seasons that no king or army could possibly fix. To understand its unique horror, we must distinguish it from the other great medieval calamity that would follow a generation later, the Black Death. While the plague was a biological catastrophe, a swift and terrifying epidemic that swept through populations, the Great Famine was an environmental stranglehold. It was slow, pervasive, and inescapable. The plague attacked the body directly, but the famine attacked the entire system that sustained the body. It eroded food supplies month after month, year after year, grinding down resilience, savings, and hope. One was a sudden, sharp shock, the other a prolonged, crushing pressure. This distinction is crucial because it means the archaeological evidence we find for the famine tells a different kind of story. It reveals not a sudden, mass event, but a slow unraveling, a story written in weakened bones, shrinking villages, and changing landscapes. The Great Rain did not just ruin a harvest, it rewrote the rules of survival for an entire continent. Monastic scribes recording events from their quiet cloisters left us the first echoes of this disaster. Their chronicles speak of universal dearth, of a great mortality of poor people, and of grain prices rising to impossible heights. Royal accounts note the difficulty in collecting taxes from emptied villages. These written sources are invaluable, giving the famine its name and a rough timeline. Yet they are also windows with a very narrow view. They were written by and for the educated elite, often monks or clerks, whose primary concern was how events affected their own institutions or the stability of the realm. The suffering they describe is often impersonal, a statistic of social collapse rather than a record of individual experience. We read of widespread hardship, but we seldom hear the voice of the peasant whose children cried from hunger, or the small farmer who watched his fields turn to swamp. The written record tells us that it happened, but it struggles to show us how it was truly lived. For that, we must listen to a different kind of testimony, one that comes not from parchment but from the earth. Archaeology steps in where the chronicles fall silent. It bypasses the bias of the scribe to speak directly with the material remains of the past. It asks not what a monk thought was worth writing down, but what the soil itself has preserved from the daily struggle for survival. This is how we move from a historical headline to a human story, by examining what people left behind, what they built, what they ate, and even the physical conditions of their lives. We can begin to understand the true scale of this climate-driven crisis for the vast majority of the population who never appeared in any official record. What does the silent evidence of a forgotten village or the subtle changes in a family's diet tell us about resilience and despair? To uncover that human story, archaeologists wield a quiet but powerful set of tools. Their work is a form of forensic science applied to entire communities and landscapes, reading the subtle clues left behind by generations under pressure. This investigation relies on several key lines of evidence, each offering a different perspective on the past. The first looks directly at the people themselves through the study of human skeletal remains, a field known as bioarchaeology. Bones and teeth become a biological archive, recording periods of stress, illness, and nutritional hardship that occurred during an individual's lifetime. A second line of inquiry examines animal bones, or zooarchaeology. By studying what species were present, their ages at the time they were used, and even the butchery marks on their bones, researchers can trace profound shifts in diet, economy, and the desperate choices people made when food became scarce. A third crucial method is archaeobotany, the analysis of ancient plant remains. This includes everything from preserved seeds and grains found in storage pits or floor layers, to the microscopic pollen that tells us what was growing in the landscape. This evidence reveals crop failures, changes in what people were trying to cultivate, and even the consumption of famine foods like weeds or bark. Finally, archaeologists study the settlements themselves. The layout of villages, the construction and abandonment of homes, and the patterns of land use all tell a story of social contraction and adaptation. Each of these methods is like a single thread. When woven together, they create a robust tapestry of evidence, far stronger than any one source could provide alone. In the following sections, we will follow each of these threads in turn, seeing how the silent testimony of bones, seeds, and abandoned homes builds an undeniable case for a climate-driven collapse. The story of the famine is written in the very bones of those who endured it. When written records speak only of general suffering, bioarchaeology offers a personal testimony, a biological diary of hardship etched into the human skeleton during life. Our bodies, under sustained stress, leave permanent markers, and by studying cemeteries from the early 14th century, researchers can read these silent signatures of crisis. One of the most telling pieces of evidence comes from our teeth. A condition known as linear enamel hypoplasia appears as horizontal grooves or lines across the surface of a tooth. These form during childhood, specifically when the body is under severe physiological stress, such as from fever or acute malnutrition. The growth of the enamel is literally interrupted, leaving a permanent scar that records the exact age at which that crisis occurred. Finding a high prevalence of these lines in a population is a clear indicator of widespread childhood hardship. Another powerful marker is found in the skull, a condition called cribra orbitalia. This presents as a spongy, porous texture on the bone of the upper eye sockets. It is strongly linked to chronic anemia, often caused by iron deficiency, which in a medieval context typically resulted from a poor diet lacking in meat and green vegetables, or from intestinal parasites exacerbated by unsanitary conditions. It is a sign of a body struggling over a long period to get the basic nutrients it needs. Long bones, like those in the legs, can also tell a story of arrested growth. So-called Harris lines are thin, dense lines that appear on X-rays within the bone. They form when growth is temporarily halted by illness or starvation, and then resumes. Think of them like the rings of a tree marking a difficult season, but within the human body. The crucial finding from famine-period cemeteries is not just the presence of these conditions in isolated individuals, but their dramatically increased frequency across entire communities. When archaeologists compare skeletons from before, during, and after the early 1300s, they see a sharp spike in these stress markers. This is the direct physical proof of a nutritional crisis. It translates the Chronicles' vague, great mortality of poor people into a tangible reality of weakened populations, of children whose growth was stunted, and of adults carrying the scars of a hungry childhood into their later years. This is the body's own witness statement, testifying to years of relentless deprivation. These skeletal stress markers tell a story of lives under constant strain, but they do not, by themselves, capture the finality of the crisis. For that, we must look to the resting places themselves, to the organization of cemeteries and the silent testimony of how communities laid their loved ones to rest. Excavations of burial grounds from the early 1400s reveal a stark demographic shift, a change in who is being buried and how. The pattern that emerges is one of profound vulnerability. The archaeological record shows a significant increase in mortality among society's most fragile members, the very young and the very old. Infant and child burials become more frequent, a heartbreaking signal of a population where the youngest could not withstand the compounded pressures of malnutrition and disease. Similarly, evidence suggests a lower average age of death among adults, indicating that the elderly and those already weakened did not survive the prolonged hardship. This isn't just a statistic, it is a window into a broken social safety net, where the traditional support systems of family and community were stretched beyond their limits. Perhaps even more telling than who was buried is the manner of their burial. In normal times, medieval Christian burial practices were orderly and individualized. People were laid to rest in consecrated ground, in single graves, often aligned east to west. During the peak famine years, however, archaeologists occasionally encounter what are termed crisis burials. These are different. They may contain multiple individuals in a single grave or show less care in the positioning of the remains. The graves might be slightly shallower or located just outside the formal boundaries of the churchyard. This is not a sign of disrespect, but rather of a community utterly overwhelmed. When death visits with such relentless frequency, the solemn rituals of mourning can collapse under sheer logistical pressure. A multiple burial might represent a family that succumbed together, or a practical response by survivors who simply lack the strength to dig separate graves. These sites are archaeological expressions of social trauma. They move us beyond the biological fact of malnutrition to its social consequence, a world where the normal rhythms of life and death were violently disrupted. The landscape of burial becomes a map of societal fracture, showing us not only that people were lost, but that the very fabric of community was unraveling under the weight of an endless, hungry rain. The silent record of the bones reveals another profound and deeply personal consequence of those hungry years. Beyond the stress lines in teeth and the porous bone of eye sockets, the famine left its mark on the very stature of the medieval population. When archaeologists measure the long bones of adults from this era, a clear and sobering trend emerges. The average height of men and women living in the decades following the Great Famine was noticeably shorter than that of their grandparents. This is not a random fluctuation, but a direct biological signature of sustained hardship. Our final adult height is largely determined during our childhood and adolescent growth spurts. For that complex process to reach its full genetic potential, the body requires a consistent and plentiful supply of nutrients, especially protein and calories. When those essentials are missing for prolonged periods, growth is permanently stunted. The body, in a desperate act of triage, redirects its limited energy to maintaining basic functions just to stay alive, sacrificing the luxury of growing taller. What the skeletal evidence shows, therefore, is a generation or even two whose bodies bear the permanent imprint of a starved childhood. They carried the shadow of the Great Rain with them, quite literally, for their entire lives. This decline in average stature is a powerful metric because it transcends individual suffering to show a population-level effect. It tells us that the crisis was so widespread and so severe that it altered the physical development of an entire society. Think of it as a historical growth chart where the line dips dramatically in the early 1400s. This data provides a heartbreaking counterpoint to the economic records of rising grain prices. The price lists tell us about cost, but the shrinking skeletons tell us about the real physical cost. They show that the famine's impact was not temporary, but was woven into the very framework of the people who survived it, a quiet testament to resilience forged at the expense of their own potential. While the skeleton tells a story of hardship, it also holds a chemical memory of the last meals consumed. To unlock this final, intimate layer of evidence, we turn to a remarkable scientific technique known as stable isotope analysis. This method allows researchers to read the dietary history of an individual written directly into the chemistry of their bones. Our bodies are built from the foods we eat, and the molecules from those foods, including specific types of atoms called isotopes, become incorporated into our tissues. Bone collagen, the organic protein framework of our skeleton, acts as a long-term dietary archive. By analyzing the ratios of different isotopes of carbon and nitrogen preserved in this collagen, scientists can reconstruct a person's average diet over the last decade or so of their life. Think of it as the body's own grocery receipt, chemically preserved for centuries. Carbon isotopes, for instance, can distinguish between diets based on different types of plants. They can tell us if someone was eating mostly wheat and barley, which follow one photosynthetic pathway, or if they were consuming significant amounts of plants like millet or sorghum, which follow another. More crucially, nitrogen isotopes act as a marker of trophic level, essentially showing where a person sat on the food chain. Higher levels of nitrogen-15 typically indicate a diet richer in animal protein like meat, dairy, and fish. Lower levels suggest a diet more heavily reliant on plant foods. In a stable, prosperous medieval community, we would expect to see a certain isotopic signature reflecting a mixed diet of grain, some meat, dairy products, and perhaps freshwater fish. But what happens when the climate fails and the harvests drown? The isotopic evidence from the famine period reveals a stark and telling shift. The chemical story in the bones begins to change, pointing towards a profound dietary collapse. The nitrogen signals often drop, suggesting a drastic reduction in precious animal protein. People were likely slaughtering their livestock early out of desperation, or simply could not afford to keep them, leading to a long-term loss of dairy and meat from their diets. Simultaneously, the carbon signatures may show an increased reliance on whatever hardy, lower-quality grains or even wild plant foods were available. This is the chemical fingerprint of dietary desperation, a silent scream from the bones that confirms what the Chronicles only hint at. The very building blocks of their bodies testify to a world where the nutritional ladder had collapsed, leaving an entire population clinging to the bottom rung. The chemical story locked within these bones is one of profound and quiet desperation. When researchers analyze the isotopic signatures from individuals who lived through the early 1300s, the data paints a clear and sobering picture of a diet in collapse. The pre-famine baseline, seen in bones from the late 13th century, typically shows a balanced medieval diet. There is evidence for regular, though not excessive, consumption of meat from domesticated animals like cattle and sheep, along with dairy products and the staple grains of wheat and barley. It was a subsistence diet, but one with some nutritional variety. The isotopic shift that occurs during the famine years is stark. The most telling change is a marked decline in those nitrogen-15 levels. This chemical drop signals a severe reduction in high-quality animal protein. People were not eating as much meat or dairy. The logical explanation fits the historical context perfectly. Faced with ruined harvests and no fodder, farmers would have been forced to slaughter their livestock prematurely. This might provide a short-term glut of meat, but it was a catastrophic long-term strategy. It destroyed the future source of milk, cheese, and breeding stock, effectively burning the agricultural bridge behind them. Once those animals were gone, that source of protein vanished for years. Simultaneously, the carbon isotopes often tell a parallel story of substitution. With grain stores depleted, communities turned to whatever could fill hungry stomachs. The isotopic fingerprints can point towards an increased reliance on legumes like peas and beans, which fix nitrogen from the air and thus have a different chemical signature than cereal grains. More tellingly, in some coastal or riverine areas, the data suggests a sudden, increased dependence on marine or freshwater fish. While fish might seem like a good source of protein, this shift is not a sign of prosperity, but of necessity. Fishing was often a risky, seasonal activity, not the backbone of the daily diet. A surge in fish consumption indicates that the land had truly failed them, forcing people to take to the water in a desperate gamble for survival. The most heartbreaking evidence comes from the potential identification of true famine foods. Certain wild plants like bracken fern have a very distinct isotopic signature. Finding hints of these signals in human bone collagen would be the ultimate chemical testimony to hunger, showing that people were resorting to foraging for tough, fibrous, and often barely nutritious plants just to feel something in their bellies. This isotopic narrative moves us from general hardship to specific, grim adaptation. It reveals a society not just eating less, but eating differently and eating worse, their bodies slowly reconfigured by scarcity itself. While isotopes reveal a story written in bone, the fields themselves hold a more direct testimony. Archaeobotany, the study of ancient plant remains, allows us to walk those drowned medieval fields and sift through the very grains that failed to grow. In the layers of soil corresponding to the early 1300s, a silent but devastating record is preserved. The most telling evidence comes from the grain itself, specifically the caryopsis, which is the seed or kernel. In normal harvests, these kernels are plump and fully formed, a sign of a healthy, ripened crop. But from famine-era sites, archaeologists consistently recover something different. They find a high percentage of smaller, shrunken, and misshapen caryopses. These are not just old grains, they are grains that never matured. They are the physical result of a summer too cold and too wet, where the plant struggled to transfer nutrients to the seed before the rains rotted the stalk. Holding one of these tiny, withered kernels is to hold the cause of the crisis in the palm of your hand. It represents a catastrophic loss of caloric yield. A field sown with the same effort but producing only these stunted seeds would feed a fraction of the people it was meant to sustain. This shrinkage is a direct measure of hunger, quantified not in written words but in millimeters of failed promise. Alongside these pitiful grains, another botanical witness emerges, one that thrives on disaster. The pollen and seed records from this period show a dramatic increase in certain weed species, particularly those that favor waterlogged, disturbed ground. Plants like sedges, rushes, and various damp-loving grasses begin to dominate the archaeological samples. This is not a coincidence. When constant rain prevents proper plowing and churns the soil into mud, these hardy invaders move in. Their sudden prevalence in the archaeological record is a clear environmental signature. It tells us that the fields were not just unproductive, they were transforming into something else entirely, into sodden wetlands where crops could not compete. The very landscape was changing under the relentless downpour, and the weed seeds preserved in storage pits and floor layers are the fingerprints of that change. Perhaps the most poignant finds are the subtle traces of desperation. In some sites, archaeologists identify the remains of plants not typically considered food. There might be evidence for increased gathering of wild resources like hazelnuts or berries, a sign of people supplementing a collapsing diet. More grimly, there can be traces of so-called famine foods, like the seeds of orach or goosefoot, weedy plants that are edible but provide very little nutritional value. Their presence in a context where they were normally cleared away suggests that people were scouring the margins of their failing fields, collecting anything that could be boiled into a thin, bitter gruel. This archaeobotanical evidence completes a terrible picture. It moves from the broad climate event, the Great Rain, to its specific, local impact on a single village harvest. The shrunken grain, the invading weeds, and the foraged seeds together form a material triad of agricultural collapse. They show us a food system breaking down from the ground up, leaving communities to stare at empty storage pits and fields that had turned against them, whispering a truth that no chronicler could fully capture: the quiet, botanical sound of a society's sustenance slipping away. The shrunken grains and invading weeds tell a story of fields failing, but inside the homes themselves, an even more intimate record of hunger was left behind. Archaeologists sifting through the floor layers and rubbish pits of peasant dwellings from this era sometimes find a quiet, telling clue: the carbonized remains of plants that have no business being in a grain storage bin or cooking pot. Among the expected traces of wheat and barley, they discover the shells of acorns, the tough seeds of wild grasses like goosefoot, and the faint impressions of roots and tubers from marsh plants. These are not the ingredients of a normal medieval meal. They are the botanical signatures of a society pushed to its absolute limits. In a stable year, acorns were food for pigs, not people. They require extensive processing to leach out bitter tannins, and even then, they offer poor nutrition. Their presence in a domestic context is a powerful behavioral marker. It means someone, likely a hungry family, went into the woods to gather them, painstakingly prepared them, and consumed them because there was simply nothing else left. This turn to foraging represents a fundamental breakdown in the agricultural cycle. When the sown fields drown, the only option left is to scavenge from the wild landscape, a return to a much older, more precarious way of life. These so-called famine foods are defined by their low nutritional return for the effort required. Boiling tough roots into a thin paste or grinding acorns into a bitter flour takes tremendous time and energy, calories that the starving body can ill afford to spend. Their consumption is an act of nutritional desperation, a clear signal that the normal channels of food production had completely collapsed. This shift from cultivated grains to foraged wild plants is one of the clearest archaeological indicators of societal stress. It shows adaptation, yes, but adaptation of the grimmest kind, where survival meant redefining what was considered food itself. The story of hunger is also written in the bones of the animals that shared the medieval world. While plant remains show us failing crops, the study of animal bones, or zooarchaeology, reveals the desperate economic choices made when those crops disappeared. In a stable farming community, livestock were a form of walking wealth and future security. Cattle provided dairy and plow power, sheep gave wool and milk, and pigs were a source of meat. Their management followed a careful, long-term logic. You would keep a healthy herd, breeding them to ensure a steady supply of milk, wool, and new young animals for the future. The slaughter of these animals was typically strategic, targeting older individuals whose primary productive years were over, or young males not needed for breeding. This pattern leaves a distinct signature in the archaeological record, known as a kill-off profile. By examining the ages at which animals were butchered, researchers can read a community's priorities. A normal profile shows a balance, with peaks at maturity for meat and at old age. But in the layers of soil dating to the famine years, that profile changes dramatically. The evidence points to a sharp, alarming increase in the slaughter of very young livestock. We find a disproportionate number of bones from calves, lambs, and piglets. This is a signature of crisis. Killing a young animal is the ultimate short-term solution. It provides an immediate, one-time supply of meat, but it utterly sacrifices the future. That calf would have grown into a dairy cow, that lamb into a wool-bearing ewe. By culling them so early, farmers were essentially eating their seed corn. They were consuming their capital, trading tomorrow's security for today's survival. This shift in the kill-off profile is one of the most powerful pieces of zooarchaeological evidence for societal collapse. It shows a community whose planning horizon has shrunk from years to days. The long-term rhythm of the agricultural year, the patient investment in future flocks and herds, was shattered by the relentless pressure of empty bellies. The bones tell us that when the rain refused to stop, hope for the future was one of the first things to be slaughtered. But the story told by animal bones goes even deeper than a simple change in slaughter patterns. The very size and health of the animals themselves began to diminish. When archaeologists measure the skeletal remains of cattle and sheep from the early 14th century, they find a clear and troubling trend. The bones are smaller, more slender, and less robust than those from the generations before the Great Rain. This shrinkage is not a trivial detail. It is a direct physical record of an ecosystem in collapse. The size of a domestic animal is not fixed by genetics alone. It is profoundly shaped by its environment, by the quality and quantity of its food from birth to maturity. A well-fed calf on rich pasture grows into a large, strong ox. A hungry calf, struggling to find nourishment in waterlogged fields or on overgrazed, nutrient-poor land, will become a stunted, weaker adult. The smaller bones unearthed from this period are the silent testament to years of nutritional stress on the herds themselves. They tell us that the pastures were failing, that the traditional meadows where animals grazed were likely as sodden and unproductive as the grain fields. There was simply not enough good grass to go around. This problem was compounded by the desperate consumption of winter fodder. In normal times, farmers would carefully store hay and straw to sustain their animals through the cold months. During the famine, that precious fodder would have been a heartbreaking choice. Eat it yourself to stave off starvation, or save it to keep your breeding stock alive for a future that seemed increasingly uncertain. Many likely chose the former, leaving the surviving animals to face the winter in a weakened state, if they survived at all. This cycle of poor pasture and missing fodder created a biological feedback loop of decline. The weakest animals died, and those that survived did so in a compromised condition, passing on their stunted growth not just through hardship, but potentially through their genes. When farmers were forced to slaughter their best breeding stock in a crisis, they were left to rebuild their herds from the smaller, less hardy animals that remained. Over several generations, this could lead to a permanent reduction in the overall size and strength of livestock across the region. So the smaller bones are more than a sign of a few lean years. They are evidence of a broken agricultural system. The famine did not just reduce the number of animals, it degraded their very quality, eroding the foundational wealth of the medieval economy from the inside out. The strength needed to pull a plow, the health required to produce milk, the robustness to survive another harsh season, all were quietly leaching away, leaving communities not just hungry in the present, but fundamentally poorer and more vulnerable for the future. The bones and seeds speak of individual hardship, but the land itself bears the scars of a society in retreat. When we pull back from the single skeleton or the lone storage pit to view the wider landscape, the scale of the disaster becomes breathtakingly clear. Across England, archaeological field surveys reveal a haunting pattern etched into the earth, a pattern of abandonment and contraction that maps directly onto the hungry years of the early 1400s. Villages that had thrived for generations simply vanish from the record. Their names linger on maps, but the physical traces, the post holes of homes, the outlines of streets, and the boundaries of fields fade into the soil. In other places, settlements did not disappear entirely but shrank dramatically, retreating in on themselves like a wounded animal. Large, dispersed farmsteads on marginal land were the first to be given up as families pulled back to the relative security of a village core. Within those surviving villages, archaeologists find evidence of houses falling into disrepair and not being rebuilt, their plots left empty, slowly reclaimed by weeds. This is not the normal, slow churn of a living community. It is the stark signature of a rapid and catastrophic population decline. Each abandoned home represents a family that left or a line that ended. Each overgrown field marks a surrender to the relentless weather, an admission that the land could no longer support those who worked it. This retreat from the landscape is the ultimate archaeological proof of the famine's societal impact. It shows a kingdom not just suffering but physically contracting, its human footprint growing fainter with each passing year of rain and hunger. The empty spaces between settlements grew wider, and the silence that settled over those abandoned fields was the silence of a broken agricultural world. This retreat from the land left behind a ghostly imprint, one that modern archaeology can trace with startling clarity. In places like the Yorkshire Wolds or the rolling countryside of the Midlands, the ground tells a story of sudden silence. Excavations of rural settlements abandoned in the early 1400s reveal homes frozen in a moment of crisis, their final days preserved under layers of soil and turf. Walking across such a site today, you might see only gentle bumps and depressions in a farmer's field. But to an archaeologist, these are the foundations of a lost world, and what is found inside them speaks volumes about how that world ended. When a house is abandoned in an orderly, planned manner, people take their valuables, they pack their best tools, their cherished personal items, and their usable furniture. What remains are the broken, the worn out, and the worthless. But in many famine-era abandonments, the pattern is different. Researchers often uncover a scatter of perfectly usable objects left behind. A worn but repairable iron knife blade might be found on a hearthstone. A simple spindle whorl used for spinning wool could be lying in a corner. Perhaps a quern stone, the essential tool for grinding grain, sits abandoned in the center of a floor. These are not treasures, but they are vital, everyday items that represented significant investment and effort to acquire. Their presence suggests a departure that was anything but orderly. Finding a serviceable tool left on the floor is like hearing a door slam shut in haste. It hints at a moment when the practical concerns of packing were overwhelmed by a more urgent imperative: to leave, and to leave now. The cumulative picture from these empty homes is not one of a slow, generational decline, but of a tipping point reached. It suggests that for many families, the crisis was not a gradual slope but a cliff edge. After years of dwindling harvests, selling off possessions, and watching neighbors leave, a final trigger, perhaps another failed sowing season or the outbreak of illness among a weakened population, forced the last holdouts to walk away from everything they could not carry. They left behind the heavy quern stone because it was too burdensome for a desperate journey. They left the knife because they had no food left to cut with it. These silent, ordinary objects become powerful emotional artifacts. They are the archaeological equivalent of a story cut off mid-sentence, telling us that for the final residents of these villages, the story of home was over. Those abandoned homes stood at the center of a wider, equally broken landscape. To understand the full collapse, we must step outside the empty village and into the silent fields that once sustained it. Medieval agriculture was a meticulously organized system, a partnership between community and land that left its own distinct fingerprint on the earth, a pattern known as ridge and furrow. Across the English countryside, even today, you can sometimes see these gentle, sinuous waves in a pasture, long, curved banks separated by shallow troughs. They are the fossilized remains of medieval plowing, created over generations by teams of oxen pulling heavy plows in a consistent back and forth motion. Each ridge was a raised planting bed, improving drainage for the crops while the furrow channeled away excess water. This was not a haphazard arrangement, it was a highly managed landscape, a testament to collective labor and long-term planning. The shape and organization of these fields tell a story of stability, but when archaeologists study these ancient field systems in regions hardest hit by the Great Famine, the story they tell changes dramatically. The ridge and furrow itself becomes a historical document, and its pages from the early 1400s speak of neglect and surrender. The first clue lies in what is called the marginal land. In prosperous times, a growing population pushes the boundaries of cultivation. Farmers would clear woodlands, drain marshes, and plow up lighter, poorer soils on hillsides or at the edges of the village territory. These were risky ventures, demanding more effort for smaller returns, but they were worth it when every extra bushel of grain counted. Archaeological surveys show that during the famine period, these marginal lands were the first to be given up. We can trace this abandonment through a sudden lack of activity. There is no new ridge and furrow carved into these difficult soils after the early 1300s. Existing fields on poor ground show no signs of being replowed or maintained. The physical evidence suggests that as labor became scarce due to illness and death, and as the climate made farming these tricky areas even more hopeless, communities made a brutal calculation. They concentrated their dwindling energy on the best, most fertile core fields closest to home, and let the rest go fallow. This retreat from the margins is a clear signal of a society losing ground, literally and figuratively, contracting its ambitions back to a desperate defensive core. This neglect extended to the very structure of the fields themselves. Maintaining a ridge and furrow system required constant communal effort. Each autumn after the harvest, the strips would be plowed again, reinforcing the banks and clearing the furrows. Boundaries between individual strips, often marked by grassy balks or simple stones, needed to be respected to prevent disputes. The archaeological record from this era suggests this careful management broke down. In some places, the distinctive ridges begin to soften and blur in the layers corresponding to the famine. Without annual plowing, they would slowly erode, washed by the very rains that had caused the disaster. More telling is the evidence for the disappearance of boundary markers, where archaeologists might expect to find the remnants of these dividing lines. They instead find a homogenization of the soil. This indicates that the precise, strip-based farming system, which required coordination and shared rules, was fragmenting. When a community is focused on sheer survival, the meticulous upkeep of shared field boundaries becomes a low priority. The orderly quilt of individual plots began to fray at the edges, merging back into an undifferentiated expanse, a physical manifestation of social cohesion unraveling. The ultimate testament to this agricultural collapse is a profound change in the land's very purpose. In numerous locations, the subtle evidence locked in the soil tells a final, quiet story. Pollen analysis from the layers above abandoned ridge and furrow reveals a dramatic shift. The pollen grains from cereal crops like wheat and rye, which dominate during periods of active farming, suddenly decline. In their place, pollen from grasses and heathers surges. This is the botanical signature of a field falling asleep. It tells us that arable land, painstakingly carved into ridges for crops, was reverting to pasture or simply waste ground. The land was no longer being sown. It was perhaps being used for sporadic grazing by whatever scrawny livestock remained, or it was left completely untended, slowly being reclaimed by wild plants. This reversion from field to pasture is not a neutral event. It is an archaeological diagnosis of systemic failure. It represents the breakdown of agricultural management, the loss of the labor force needed to plow and sow, and the final admission that the old rhythms of grain production were no longer sustainable. The fields themselves, in their silence, were declaring the famine's victory. The landscape was healing in its own way, covering the scars of human endeavor with grass. But that green blanket was a shroud over a way of life that the great rain had washed away. The objects people left behind in their homes tell a final, quiet story of economic ruin. When a society is starving, its material world shrinks, not just in the fields but in the very pots and pans used every day. The archaeological record of household goods from the early 1400s reveals a landscape of loss far beyond empty grain stores. One of the most telling shifts is in the pottery, the broken ceramic fragments that blanket every medieval site. In prosperous times, even peasant households used a variety of wares. There were sturdy cooking pots, jugs for ale or water, and perhaps even a few finer, glazed vessels for special occasions or to show a small measure of success. Pottery was both a practical tool and a subtle signal of status and connection. After the famine, this diversity often fades. Excavations show a noticeable decline in both the quality and variety of ceramic finds. The pottery becomes plainer, cruder, and more uniform. Glazed wares, which required extra fuel and skill to produce, become rare or disappear entirely from rural sites. People were making do with the most basic, functional items, and even those were likely repaired repeatedly until they fell apart. This isn't just about aesthetics, it is a direct reflection of a shattered economy. Pottery production was a specialized craft. Potters needed clay, kilns, and fuel, and they relied on local markets and trade networks to sell their wares. When entire villages emptied out and those who remained had no surplus to spend, the market for anything beyond absolute essentials collapsed. The local potter might have given up his craft, or his work became so rudimentary it is hard for archaeologists to distinguish it from homemade attempts. The simplification of pottery is a material echo of a simplified, impoverished life. This contraction extends to the wider world of trade. In layers of soil from before the crisis, archaeologists often find small, telling treasures that speak of connection. There might be a piece of stone from a distant quarry used as a hone for sharpening knives, or a shard of fine pottery imported from France or the Low Countries. Even a single glass bead or a delicate bronze brooch pin speaks to networks of exchange, however modest. These items show that communities, even remote ones, were tied into a larger economic web. Goods and ideas moved along rivers and roads, linking the peasant's cottage to regional markets and beyond. In the archaeological layers corresponding to the famine's aftermath, these connections often fray to the breaking point. The quantity of such non-local items found on rural sites drops dramatically. It is as if a light has been dimmed. The stone hone might be replaced by a piece of local sandstone that doesn't work as well. The imported pottery vanishes completely. This isn't because people no longer wanted nice things, but because the mechanisms to obtain them had broken down. Trade requires surplus. It requires farmers to have extra grain or wool to sell, and merchants with the security to transport goods along safe roads. It requires a population with enough disposable wealth to buy something that isn't strictly necessary for survival. The famine wiped all that away. Roads became dangerous as desperation increased, markets shrank or ceased to function, and every ounce of energy and resource was redirected towards the single, all-consuming goal of finding the next meal. The silence in the archaeological record, the absence of these small traded goods, is a powerful negative proof. It shows the isolation that followed the hunger, a retreat into a smaller, poorer, and more insular world. Taken together, this material culture of poverty paints a comprehensive picture of systemic collapse. The decline in household goods and the evaporation of trade items are not separate phenomena. They are two symptoms of the same disease. They reveal an economy that had moved beyond a temporary recession into a fundamental reset. Disposable wealth, the little extra that allowed for repair, replacement, and small luxuries, had been utterly consumed, quite literally, by years of hunger. Local craftsmen found no customers, and regional trade networks starved from a lack of goods and buyers. What we see in the broken, planar pottery and the empty spaces where traded goods should be is the archaeological signature of a society stripped to its bare bones. The everyday objects of life became mere survivors, just like the people who used them, bearing the scars of a long and desperate struggle just to persist. This economic retreat is echoed in the smallest and most telling of artifacts, the humble coin. In a stable medieval economy, coins were the lifeblood of local trade, used to pay rents, purchase goods at markets, and facilitate transactions beyond simple barter. They were a symbol of connection to a wider royal and commercial system. For archaeologists, the presence of lost or discarded coins in soil layers helps map the pulse of economic activity. A steady trickle of coin finds suggests a monetized society where people regularly handled cash. During the famine years, however, that trickle often dries to a drip. On many rural sites, especially those of peasant households, there is a noticeable scarcity of coins minted in the period from roughly 1315 to 1325. This absence speaks volumes. It is not that people suddenly became more careful with their money, but rather that they had far less money to be careless with. For the vast majority of the population, coins became a rare and precious commodity. When every scrap of surplus grain was consumed just to survive, there was nothing left to sell at market, and thus no reason to earn or handle coinage. The monetary economy, which had been slowly growing for centuries, contracted violently. In many communities, exchange likely reverted to older forms of barter, a direct swap of goods or labor without the intermediary of cash. A day's work might be paid in a loaf of bread, not a penny. A worn blanket might be traded for a handful of beans. This shift away from coinage is a clear archaeological signal of economic simplification and localization. It tells us that the complex web of royal mints, traveling merchants, and local markets had frayed under the stress of universal scarcity. The silence of the soil, where we expect to find a few scattered coins, confirms a profound truth. The Great Famine did not just empty granaries and villages, it emptied pockets, leaving a society too poor to even lose the small change of daily life. The silent testimony of the soil is compelling, but it does not stand alone. To confirm that this was not merely a series of local tragedies but a continent-wide climate event, we must look beyond the abandoned villages and stunted grains. The proof lies in archives that predate human history itself, locked in the ice of distant glaciers, the rings of ancient trees, and the deep, layered mud of lake beds. These natural records, known as climate proxies, offer an independent verdict on the weather of the early 1400s. Take the ice cores drilled from the Greenland ice sheet, for example. Each year's snowfall compresses into a distinct layer, trapping within it tiny bubbles of the ancient atmosphere and fine dust from distant storms. Scientists analyzing cores from this period find clear chemical signatures of a sustained cold snap. The ratios of different oxygen isotopes in the ice point to lower average temperatures. Furthermore, an increase in wind-blown dust suggests stormier, more turbulent atmospheric conditions over the northern Atlantic, patterns consistent with the relentless rains described in European chronicles. This icy ledger confirms that the cold and wet were not an English peculiarity, but a hemispheric shift. Then there are the tree rings. An oak tree growing in an English forest during those years tells its own story of hardship. Each annual ring's width is a diary of that growing season's conditions. A wide ring indicates a good year with ample sun and rain at the right times. A narrow, tightly packed ring signals stress from drought, from cold, or crucially, from too much water at the wrong time. Dendrochronologists, scientists who study these patterns, have built continuous timelines stretching back centuries. The rings from oaks across northern Europe, dated to the early 1300s, consistently show a dramatic sequence of narrow growth bands. This tells us the trees themselves were struggling, their growth stunted by the same miserable summers that were drowning the wheat and barley in the fields below. The trees, with no political agenda or monastic bias, independently record the Great Rain. Finally, sediment cores from lake beds and peat bogs add another layer of confirmation. As the landscape became sodden, erosion increased. Pollen grains washed into lakes show that shift from crop pollen to weed and grass pollen we saw locally, but on a regional scale. The very composition of the mud changes, with layers indicating more runoff from bare, unstable soils. Together, these disparate lines of evidence from ice, wood, and mud converge on a single, inescapable conclusion. They verify that the early 1400s marked the opening chapter of a broader climatic downturn often called the Little Ice Age. The archaeological collapse in England was not a random failure, but the direct, documented consequence of a planet whose climate had turned against the delicate balance of medieval farming. The bones in the ground and the shrunken seeds are the human echo of a signal written in ice and tree rings, a profound reminder that human history is always a conversation with the environment. Yet the climate shock did not strike a society at its peak. Archaeology reveals a kingdom already standing on fragile ground, its resilience worn thin by decades of its own success. The relentless rains of 1315 fell upon a landscape that was, in many ways, already exhausted. For generations leading up to the Great Famine, England had experienced a remarkable period of growth. The population had expanded, pushing upwards from perhaps 2 million people after the Norman conquest to around 5 or 6 million by the turn of the 14th century. This success, however, came at a cost, creating a set of deeply vulnerable conditions that would magnify the coming disaster. The evidence for this pre-existing pressure is written into the land itself, in the very density of human settlement. Field surveys show a countryside that was, by 1300, intensely occupied. Villages were large and closely spaced. New hamlets and farmsteads, identified by scatters of pottery and building debris, sprouted in areas once considered marginal, on hillsides, in wooded clearings, and on poorer soils. This expansion speaks to a booming population, but also to a system operating at its very limits. Every available acre was being pressed into service to feed the growing numbers. There was little slack in the system, no vast reserves of uncultivated land to fall back on when the core fields failed. The kingdom was farming right up to the edge of its capacity, a fact that made the climatic collapse not just a hardship, but a mathematical impossibility. When the yields from those overworked fields plummeted, there was simply nowhere else to turn. This intensive farming left another silent signature in the soil, one of gradual depletion. The medieval agricultural system, for all its ingenuity, was extractive. Farmers practiced a simple crop rotation, often planting a field with wheat or barley one year and letting it lie fallow the next to recover. But with more mouths to feed, the pressure to produce led to shorter fallow periods and the repeated planting of the same demanding cereal crops year after year. This relentless cycle slowly leached essential nutrients from the earth. While direct chemical proof is complex, archaeologists see strong indirect evidence for this soil exhaustion. One clue comes from the changing size of livestock, which we discussed earlier. The gradual reduction in animal size before the famine may not only reflect poor pasture, but also a decline in the overall nutritional quality of the landscape. Weaker pastures produce weaker animals. Another clue is found in the persistent push onto those marginal lands. Why would communities take on the back-breaking work of clearing stony hillsides or draining boggy ground if the existing fertile fields were more than sufficient? The logical answer is that they were not. The best land was likely showing diminishing returns, forcing people to expend ever more effort for ever smaller gains just to maintain the status quo. The kingdom was, in a very real sense, eating into its agricultural capital. The soil's ability to bounce back from a bad year was compromised long before the Great Rain began. When the downpours came, they did not strike a resilient, well-nourished ecosystem, but one already running on fumes. The climate shock was the match, but the tinder had been carefully laid by generations of expansion. Beneath this demographic and environmental strain lay a third, crucial vulnerability: the stark structure of economic inequality. Medieval England was not a society of equals, and the archaeological record makes this disparity quietly clear. The differences between the manor house and the peasant cottage were profound and material. Excavations of lordly sites from the late 13th century reveal stone foundations, glazed floor tiles, fine imported tableware, and evidence of a varied diet rich in meat and fish. These sites speak of wealth, connection, and security. Contrast this with the contemporaneous peasant dwellings, often simple timber and wattle structures with beaten earth floors. Their material culture is sparse, dominated by coarse, locally made pottery and simple iron tools. The dietary evidence from these sites, even in good times, shows a heavy reliance on bread and pottage, with meat as a rare luxury. This divide was not merely about comfort, it was about power and entitlement. The manorial system meant that a significant portion of every harvest, often a third or more, went directly to the lord as rent or tithe. This was a fixed demand, one that did not lessen when the rains came and the crops shriveled. For the peasant family staring at a half-empty storage pit, the lord's portion still had to be paid. This created a terrifying funnel of scarcity. What little food was produced was siphoned upward by obligation, leaving those who labored on the land with the least buffer against failure. The social structure, therefore, acted as a giant amplifier for the climatic signal. It ensured that the pain of the famine was not distributed evenly, but was concentrated overwhelmingly on the shoulders of those least able to bear it. The archaeological picture is one of a society already divided into haves and have-nots, a fracture line that the Great Famine would exploit with brutal efficiency. The crisis was not an equalizer, but a magnifier of pre-existing fault lines. When the system shattered, it did so along the seams that were already there, built into the very foundations of medieval life. Yet the Great Famine was not a single, monolithic shadow that fell equally across the entire kingdom. The silent evidence from the soil reveals a landscape of starkly uneven suffering, a patchwork of devastation where the fate of a community could hinge on the luck of its local geography and the character of its lord. Archaeology allows us to map this uneven impact, contrasting the tragic silence of abandoned upland hamlets with the more resilient, though still strained, rhythms of some lowland manors. This variation is crucial, for it shows that while the climate delivered the blow, local conditions decided how hard it would land. Consider the high, wind-swept moorlands of regions like Dartmoor or the Yorkshire Dales. These were marginal lands even in the best of times, settled during the population boom of the 13th century by families pushing the boundaries of cultivation. The archaeological record here tells a story of near-total retreat. Field surveys show these upland settlements were often completely deserted during the famine years and never reoccupied. The small stone foundations of their homes stand as lonely ruins, with no later pottery or debris to suggest anyone returned. The soil layers show a rapid and permanent reversion from field to wild pasture. For these communities perched on poor soil with short growing seasons, the relentless cold and wet were a death sentence. Their existence was already precarious, balanced on the very edge of viability, and the great rain simply pushed them over it. There was no buffer, no reserve, and so they vanished from the landscape, leaving behind only the faint, ghostly outlines of their fields for archaeologists to later trace. In stark contrast, the evidence from some well-established lowland manors, particularly those on fertile river valleys or with access to diverse resources, paints a different, though still grim, picture. Excavations at sites like the village of Warham Percy in Yorkshire, which survived the famine, show continuity but also profound stress. Here, we do not find total abandonment, but rather a pattern of contraction and adaptation. Some houses at the edge of the village fell into disuse, their plots absorbed by neighbors. The animal bone evidence might show the same desperate slaughter of young stock, but perhaps followed by a slightly quicker recovery in herd size in the decades after. The key difference often lay in the quality of the land itself. Rich, well-drained soils in valley bottoms could withstand a few bad years better than thin, waterlogged soils on a hillside. A manor with extensive meadows for hay production or access to river fish had alternative food sources to buffer the grain shortfall. But perhaps the most decisive factor of all, one that archaeology can subtly reveal, was the management style of the local lord. The manorial system was not a monolith, it was a personal contract, and its harshness varied from place to place. Some lords, facing the same crisis as their tenants, may have temporarily relaxed the rigid demands for rent or labor service, understanding that starving peasants could not work next year's fields. The archaeological signature of such flexibility might be less dramatic. We might see continued, though reduced, maintenance of buildings and fields, suggesting the community retained just enough cohesion and resources to keep functioning. Other lords, however, enforced their traditional rights with unyielding rigor, a policy that archaeology can expose through its consequences. On manors where the documentary record suggests particularly strict estate management, the physical evidence often points to more severe hardship. The skeletal remains from associated cemeteries might show higher frequencies of those stress markers like linear enamel hypoplasia. The zooarchaeological record could indicate a more complete collapse of the local animal economy, with no evidence for herd recovery. Most tellingly, the settlement pattern might show a sharper, more permanent contraction, as desperate families fled the estate entirely in search of less oppressive conditions or simply succumbed. This contrast in manorial response turns the famine from a natural disaster into a profoundly human drama. It illustrates that the social structure was not just a passive amplifier of climate stress, but an active agent that could either mitigate or magnify the crisis. The Lord's decision, recorded not in a charter but in the bones and abandoned homes of his tenants, became a matter of life and death. So the uneven map of suffering that emerges is a product of two intersecting forces: the environmental lottery of soil and topography, and the human variable of lordship. Some communities, through luck of location and grace of management, endured the storm, battered but not broken. Others, caught on poor land under a relentless lord, were simply erased, their stories ending in the early 1400s, their fields returning to silence. This regional mosaic, pieced together from fragments of pottery, bone, and pollen, teaches us a sobering lesson about vulnerability. It shows that in the face of a changing climate, there are no universal victims, only those placed by geography and by power directly in the path of the storm. The silent ruins on the Yorkshire wolds offer a perfect microcosm of the national tragedy. This rolling chalk landscape in eastern England holds some of the most powerful and complete archaeological evidence for the famine's impact, a convergence of clues that tell a unified story of collapse. Here, the deserted medieval villages are not just names on a map, but physical spaces where every layer of evidence, from the cemetery to the field boundary, speaks in unison. One of the most famous of these sites is Warham Percy, a village whose life spanned centuries, but whose story is forever marked by the early 1400s. Excavations here provide a textbook example of how skeletal, settlement, and landscape evidence intertwine to document disaster. The human remains from Warham Percy's churchyard tell a personal story of hardship. Bioarchaeological analysis revealed a population bearing the clear signs of nutritional stress. A significant number of skeletons showed evidence of cribra orbitalia, those porous lesions in the eye sockets linked to chronic anemia and dietary deficiency. This was not an isolated condition, but a widespread marker across the community, indicating that the lack of essential nutrients was a common, grinding reality for years. Furthermore, studies of the teeth revealed linear enamel hypoplasias, those horizontal grooves signaling childhood physiological crises. The high frequency of these lines in individuals who lived through the early 1300s points to a generation that faced severe hardship during their formative years. These are not just anonymous statistics, they are the biological records of real people whose bodies absorbed the strain of failed harvests and empty larders. The bones whisper of resilience tested to its absolute limit. This biological stress is mirrored perfectly in the fate of the village itself. While Warham Percy was not completely abandoned during the famine, the archaeological record shows a dramatic and permanent contraction. The settlement shrank inward. Excavations revealed that several peasant tofts, the small farmsteads on the village outskirts, were abandoned during this period. Their boundary ditches filled in naturally, and no new houses were built to replace them. The community retrenched, pulling back to the core area around the church and manor. This retreat from the margins is a classic signature of population decline and reduced agricultural pressure. It suggests families died out, moved away, or consolidated into fewer households. Within the surviving part of the village, evidence points to a marked decline in material wealth. The quality and variety of pottery found in layers from this time become noticeably poorer. Gone are the finer, glazed wares replaced by cruder, locally made cooking pots. The number of small personal items like bronze pins or buckles also diminishes. This material poverty is the direct archaeological correlate to the skeletal evidence. A community struggling to feed itself had no surplus for anything beyond the barest essentials. The things they owned and the things they left behind reflect a world stripped down to survival. Beyond the village boundary, the fields themselves bear silent witness to the surrender. The Yorkshire wolds are famous for their preserved ridge and furrow systems, those fossilized waves of medieval ploughing. Research across this region shows a consistent pattern linked to the famine years. On the more marginal, thinner soils of the higher slopes and valley edges, the ridge and furrow simply stops. There is no evidence that these outlying fields were ploughed again after the early 1300s. They were given up, allowed to revert to pasture or scrub. This retreat from the least productive land is a clear economic decision made under duress. With a smaller population and less labor available, the community focused all its effort on the best, most fertile land closest to home. The archaeological survey of these field systems acts like a historical spreadsheet, showing a drastic reduction in cultivated acreage. Even the maintained fields tell a story of neglect. The careful, annual ploughing needed to keep the distinctive ridges sharp would have been harder to sustain with a diminished workforce. In some places, the ridges appear to soften and blur in the archaeological layers from this period, suggesting the meticulous, communal management of the open fields was breaking down. The very organization of agriculture, a system that required cooperation and shared rules, was fraying under the pressure of universal scarcity. When viewed together, the evidence from the wolds creates a devastatingly clear picture. The stressed bones in the churchyard explain why the village shrank. The abandoned tofts and poorer artifacts explain the loss of labor that led to the fields being surrendered. And the overgrown ridge and furrow explains the diminishing food supply that caused the stress in the bones. It is a closed loop of cause and effect, a local ecosystem of collapse. The Yorkshire Wolds demonstrate that the Great Famine was not a vague historical event, but a precise and measurable process. It was a wave that washed first over the marginal upland fields, then into the outlying farmsteads, and finally into the very bodies of the people in the village core. This regional case study gives us a location, a set of coordinates, where the national crisis becomes intensely local and heartbreakingly specific. In the quiet fields of the Wolds, we can walk the same ground where the choices were made to abandon a field, to leave a home, to endure another hungry winter. The convergence of evidence here offers perhaps the most compelling archaeological argument possible, proving that when the climate shifted, it rewrote the story of an entire landscape, one famished body, and one deserted village at a time. Even in the shadow of such profound collapse, the archaeological record refuses to tell a story of simple surrender. Scattered among the evidence of retreat and hardship are quieter, more stubborn clues, whispers of resilience and the fierce will to adapt. While the famine reshaped the landscape, it did not entirely erase the human capacity for ingenuity or the deep bonds of community. In the layers of soil that speak of crisis, we also find subtle traces of people trying against all odds to hold their world together. These signs of adaptation are often humble, easily overlooked, yet they are powerful testaments to a society's enduring spirit. They show that even as the system failed, individuals and communities were not passive victims of the weather, but active participants in a desperate struggle for continuity. The evidence for this resilience takes several forms, from shifts in daily practice to the remarkable speed of recovery in places that managed to endure. One of the most intimate signs of adaptation comes from the very processing of food. In normal times, the primary goal was to produce enough grain to make bread, the staple of the medieval diet. But when the harvests yielded only pitiful, shrunken grains, traditional methods became inefficient. Archaeologists find hints that communities may have turned to more intensive forms of food processing to extract every last calorie. There is evidence, for instance, for an increased use of sieves and finer milling techniques. This might seem like a small detail, but it represents a significant investment of time and labor. By grinding grain more finely and sifting it repeatedly, people could salvage a bit more flour from stunted, poorly formed kernels. It was a painstaking, inefficient process, but in a context of absolute scarcity, it was a rational adaptation. Every extra ounce of flour meant another thin portion of pottage. This shift in domestic labor speaks to a reallocation of effort, a willingness to do whatever tedious, back-breaking work was necessary to make the inadequate harvest stretch just a little further. Similarly, the increased archaeological presence of certain wild plant seeds, like orach or goosefoot, is not just a sign of hunger, but also of applied botanical knowledge. Someone had to know which wild plants were non-toxic, how to prepare them to remove bitterness, and when and where to find them. This represents a retention or a rapid revival of foraging knowledge that had likely been fading in an era of stable cereal agriculture. It was an adaptation born of necessity, a reaching back to older survival strategies to fill the void left by failing fields. This knowledge, passed through generations, became a vital lifeline. The very act of gathering and preparing these famine foods was an assertion of agency, a refusal to simply wait for the end. On a broader scale, the pattern of settlement itself reveals a strategic resilience. The total abandonment of the most marginal upland hamlets was, in a brutal sense, an adaptive strategy. By consolidating the remaining population into the more viable lowland villages, communities could concentrate their dwindling labor force and resources. This retreat was not a rout but a tactical contraction. The archaeological evidence from surviving villages like Warham Percy shows that while they shrank, they did not disintegrate. The church remained a focal point and the core manor buildings were maintained. This continuity of place is significant. It suggests that even amidst death and departure, a social nucleus endured. The community, though smaller and poorer, retained its identity and its basic structures. The fact that people continued to live there, to repair their homes, and to bury their loved ones in the churchyard is a powerful testament to tenacity. They were holding a line, defending a way of life in its most reduced but essential form. Perhaps the most compelling evidence for resilience, however, lies not in the crisis itself, but in what followed. In some regions with better soils and more flexible lordship, the archaeological record shows a surprisingly rapid demographic and economic recovery beginning in the mid-1400s. After the catastrophic population decline, conditions for the survivors paradoxically improved. With fewer people competing for resources, the value of labor rose. Peasants who remained found themselves in a stronger bargaining position with landowners. The material culture from the latter half of the 14th century begins to tell a new story. In the villages that persisted, house sizes sometimes increase. There is a gradual return of higher quality goods like better pottery and small personal items. The animal bone records show herds recovering, with a return to more normal slaughter patterns, indicating that livestock were once again being raised for long-term production rather than immediate, desperate consumption. This post-famine recovery, visible in the layers of soil above those dark years, proves the incredible regenerative capacity of medieval society. It had been bent to the breaking point, but it was not broken. When the climatic pressure finally eased, the surviving framework of knowledge, social organization, and agricultural practice provided a foundation for renewal. The resilience was there all along, woven into the fabric of daily life, in the shared knowledge of how to process a poor harvest, in the decision to retreat and consolidate, and in the stubborn commitment to home and community. These adaptations were not grand innovations, but quiet, determined acts of perseverance. They remind us that the story of the Great Famine is not solely one of loss, but also one of endurance. The people of the 1400s were not just victims of a changing climate. They were its negotiators, making 1,000 small, difficult choices to navigate a world that had suddenly become unforgiving. Their legacy, written in the subtle shifts of their tools and the survival of their homes, is a testament to the human capacity to adapt, even when the sky itself seems to have turned against them. Yet the shadow of the Great Famine was soon followed by a far darker and more famous silhouette. A single generation after the rains finally ceased, a new and terrifying catastrophe swept across England and all of Europe, the pandemic known as the Black Death, arriving in the year 1348. This presents a profound puzzle for anyone trying to read the story written in the soil. How do we separate the scars left by years of grinding hunger from the devastation wrought by a swift and deadly plague? For archaeologists, this is one of their greatest interpretive challenges, untangling two threads of disaster that are tightly knotted together in the mid-14th century record. The most obvious overlap is in the silent villages and abandoned fields. We see a landscape in the 1350s and 60s that is even emptier than it was in the 1320s. But was a particular hamlet deserted because the last starving family finally gave up after the famine, or because every resident succumbed to the plague in a matter of weeks? The final result looks the same from a distance, a collection of crumbling houses being reclaimed by nature. To differentiate between a slow unraveling and a sudden end, researchers must become detectives of the smallest details. They look for the subtle clues that hint at the pace and manner of departure. A settlement abandoned during the famine might show a pattern of gradual attrition. One house shows signs of being carefully dismantled for reusable timber, while another next door simply collapsed from neglect over several years. The artifact scatter might be thin, suggesting people had time to take their few valuable possessions when they left. In contrast, a site overwhelmed by the plague might present a more arrested picture. Here, archaeologists might find a richer, more sudden deposition of everyday objects. A cooking pot could still be sitting by the hearth as if the meal was interrupted. Tools might lie where they were last used, and personal items could be found amidst the collapse, suggesting no one survived to retrieve them. It is the difference between a planned evacuation and a sudden, terrible silence. Another key line of evidence comes from the cemeteries. The Black Death, striking a population already weakened by decades of hardship, left its own grim signature. Plague cemeteries are often characterized by their speed and scale. They may contain mass burials where individuals were interred with little ceremony, reflecting a community utterly overwhelmed by mortality in a very short time frame. The demographic profile in these burials also tends to be different. While the famine selectively targeted the very young and the old, the plague was a more egalitarian killer, striking down adults in the prime of life with terrifying efficiency. By carefully analyzing the age and sex distribution of skeletons in a cemetery, alongside the manner of burial, bioarchaeologists can sometimes distinguish a famine-period grave from a plague pit. Yet the relationship between the two disasters is not merely one of confusion, it is also one of cause and effect. Many historians and archaeologists now see the Great Famine as a crucial prelude, a societal weakening that set the stage for the plague's catastrophic impact. A population that was chronically malnourished, with stunted growth and compromised immune systems from years of scarcity, would have had far less resistance to a novel and virulent disease. The famine did not just empty villages, it hollowed out the biological resilience of the entire society. The archaeological record of the mid-14th century, therefore, tells a compound tragedy. It is the story of a 1-2 punch where the first blow from the climate left the kingdom staggering, and the second from a microscopic pathogen knocked it completely to the ground. Disentangling these two events is not just an academic exercise, it is essential for understanding the full depth of the medieval crisis. It allows us to see the Great Famine not as a forgotten prelude, but as a transformative event in its own right, one that fundamentally altered the destiny of England by making it tragically vulnerable to the storm that came next. Archaeology offers a powerful witness to the past, but its testimony is not without ambiguity. To understand the full story of the Great Famine, we must also listen to the quiet debates among the experts themselves, acknowledging the inherent challenges in reading a history written in fragments. One significant issue lies in the very evidence we rely on most, the human remains. The skeletons we study come from a tiny, and not necessarily representative, fraction of the medieval population. They are almost exclusively from Christian churchyard burials, which means they represent individuals who were accepted by their community for burial in consecrated ground. This sample may unintentionally exclude society's very poorest, those who might have been buried in unmarked plots or in times of such crisis that no formal burial was possible. Are we seeing a full cross-section of hardship, or only those who retained enough social connection to be laid to rest within the churchyard? This question reminds us that the archaeological record, for all its detail, is an incomplete ledger, missing the names of those who vanished without a trace. Dating the evidence with perfect precision presents another layer of complexity. While we can pinpoint the minting year of a coin or use tree rings to date a piece of timber, many other clues exist in a broader time frame. A shrunken grain seed found in a storage pit could have been harvested in a single bad year, or it could be the remnant of a dwindling supply eaten over several lean seasons. The subtle changes in a village layout, the gradual abandonment of a field, these processes rarely happen in a single calendar year. Archaeologists work with phases and periods, not specific dates, which means connecting a particular piece of evidence directly to the documented years of the Great Rain requires careful, sometimes contested, interpretation. We are assembling a puzzle where many pieces could fit in more than one place. These methodological challenges feed directly into ongoing scholarly discussions about the famine's true scale and severity. Some historians, looking at the written records of estate accounts and tax rolls, argue that while the famine was devastating, its impact was highly regional, and that recovery in some areas was swifter than the archaeological picture might suggest. They point out that the most dramatic evidence of abandonment often comes from landscapes that were already marginal, asking whether the famine delivered the final blow to settlements that were already in a slow decline. This perspective urges caution, reminding us not to interpret every change in the early 14th century as a direct and sole consequence of those 7 hungry years. Other scholars, however, see the convergence of skeletal, botanical, and settlement evidence as overwhelmingly persuasive. They argue that the simultaneous appearance of stress markers across widespread sites, combined with the environmental data from ice cores and tree rings, creates a coherent and undeniable narrative of a continent-wide climatic shock with profound human costs. For them, the debate is not about whether the famine happened, but about how we weigh its role in the larger transformation of medieval society, a transformation that would culminate in the Black Death. Navigating these debates does not weaken the archaeological story, it deepens it. It shows the scientific process at work, where evidence is constantly questioned, refined, and contextualized. This honest engagement with complexity is what separates a compelling narrative from a simple one. It reminds us that the past is not a single, settled truth, but a conversation we have with the silent things left behind, a conversation where every new discovery and every thoughtful critique brings us closer to understanding the resilient, vulnerable world of those who endured the Great Hunger. The scattered clues of bone, seed, and abandoned stone now demand a final synthesis. When we step back to view this mosaic of evidence as a whole, a single, powerful portrait emerges, one far richer and more devastating than any chronicle could convey alone. Each scientific discipline provides a distinct thread, but woven together, they form an unbreakable cord of proof, binding the climatic event to its human consequence with undeniable force. The biological testimony of the skeleton shows us the physical cost, the stunted growth, the lines of stress in teeth, and the signs of anemia are not random afflictions, but the uniform signatures of a generation shaped by deprivation. This is the story written on the body itself, confirming that the hardship was widespread, severe, and etched into the very framework of the people who lived it. Yet those stressed bones alone cannot tell us why. They point to a symptom but not the cause. This is where the silent witnesses of the fields and farmyards complete the picture. The archaeobotanical record provides the direct link to the failing environment. Those shrunken, malformed grains are the literal fruits of the Great Rain, the physical evidence of crops that drowned in their own fields. The surge in weed pollen and the traces of foraged famine foods show a landscape in rebellion, transforming from a managed source of sustenance into a hostile, waterlogged wilderness. The cause of the stress is suddenly, chillingly clear. It was not war, not politics, but a profound failure of the harvest, season after season. The zooarchaeological evidence then reveals the cascading economic collapse triggered by that failure. The desperate slaughter of young livestock speaks of a society eating its future to survive the present, a short-term strategy with catastrophic long-term results. The shrinking size of the animals themselves tells of pastures as starved as the people, a whole ecosystem buckling under the strain. Finally, settlement archaeology shows us the ultimate societal outcome. The abandoned villages and contracted fields are the grand landscape-scale expression of all that came before. They map the retreat of human ambition, the surrender of hard-won ground, and the silent voids left where communities once thrived. This is not a collection of unrelated tragedies, but a chain reaction with a clear origin point. The climate shift, verified by ice cores and tree rings, ruined the harvest. The ruined harvests led to malnutrition, recorded in the bones. The malnutrition weakened the population and forced desperate economic choices, seen in the animal bones. Those choices, combined with illness and death, led to labor shortages and social fracture, resulting in the abandonment of homes and fields. Every strand of evidence interlocks, each one validating and deepening the other. The historical chronicles gave us the headline, but archaeology has provided the full, heartbreaking article. It translates vague mentions of dearth and mortality into a tangible narrative of stunted children, slaughtered calves, withered seeds, and empty homes. This convergence is what makes the case so compelling. It is a story told not from a single perspective, but from a chorus of silent witnesses, all singing the same summer song of a world undone by a change in the weather. The story of the Great Famine is no longer a whisper from a chronicle, but a chorus of evidence rising from the earth itself. From the stressed lines in a child's tooth to the silent furrows of an abandoned field, every fragment converges on a single, undeniable truth. This was not a myth or a medieval exaggeration, but a physical, measurable catastrophe triggered by a changing sky. Archaeology provides the indispensable proof, transforming historical accounts into a tangible narrative of collapse, one written in bone, seed, and stone. Without this silent testimony, we would possess only half the story, a record of symptoms without the cause. The material record completes the circuit, connecting the climatic event documented in ice and tree rings directly to the human experience of hunger, loss, and resilience. It grants a voice to the millions who left no written words, ensuring their struggle is remembered not as a statistic, but as a profound chapter in our shared past. This research reaches far beyond a single century of English history. It offers a timeless lesson in human vulnerability. The medieval world, for all its social complexity and agricultural ingenuity, existed in a delicate balance with its environment. The Great Famine demonstrates with brutal clarity how a sustained shift in that environment could unravel the very fabric of society, exposing the fault lines of inequality and testing the limits of community. It reminds us that human history is not a separate story from natural history, but an ongoing conversation with the climate, the soil, and the weather. In an age of our own environmental uncertainties, the silent witnesses from the 1400s speak with renewed urgency. They show us that resilience is not just about strength, but about adaptability, about the social choices we make when the old rhythms of life are disrupted. The quiet work of uncovering these hidden chapters continues every day. Archaeologists still kneel in muddy trenches, sifting soil for clues, while scientists in labs analyze isotopes and pollen grains with tools the medieval chroniclers could never have dreamed of. Each new discovery refines our understanding, adding another piece to the vast, interconnected puzzle of the human past. So the next time you walk through the English countryside and see the gentle waves of ridge and furrow in a field, or hear of a new excavation in your local town, remember the story they hold. These are not just relics, they are pages in an unfinished book waiting to be read. By supporting and engaging with this ongoing search, we honor the lives of those who came before and ensure that their stories of both fragility and endurance continue to inform our path forward.